The biggest story of the week has undoubtedly been the US, UK's and France's decision to bomb Syria. The prospect of having Donald Trump, Theresa May and Emmanuel Macron facing off against Syria's Bashar al-Assad, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the Iranians has thrown Twitter into overdrive. A lot has been discussed, debated, speculated, and conspiracy theories have a life of their own. But as the tide settles, there's still a lot to discuss with regards to the controversy behind the airstrikes. Now, the first point, which is one that keeps creeping up on us when we discuss modern day conflicts, is were the airstrikes legitimate? Does the international system actually work, or are these states functioning in anarchy? But before we move any further, let's see what Sami Hamdi, the editor-in-chief of the International Interest and a Middle East expert and commentator, has to say about it.
Personally, I don't see how on earth the US, France or the UK have taken it upon themselves to be the judge and executor of any form of airstrikes on Syria. Syria is a state in its own right. I don't see how any of the countries, including Russia and Iran, have any right to conduct military operations in Syria. And I think this is one of the greatest calamities of our modern times from 2003, whereby the US in particular feels that it has the right to be able to act as judge and implement its own version of punishments on these various different states.
But Sami, what about the chemical weapons question? Western powers have agreed that chemical weapons are a red line. So is it hypocritical if they act when Bashar al-Assad crosses that red line?
I think it's always, whenever these issues come up, I think of course it is a great hypocrisy. So it's essentially saying that it's not worth moving when people die naturally, it's just that people have to die in a certain way. In other words, if they die by chemical weapons, we'll get angry. If they die by bombs, we won't get angry. If they die by shooting, we won't get angry. I think there's always been a huge double standards in terms of the killing that takes place particularly in the Middle East. And I think the anger is always very selective. And you see it always you can even see it in the media coverage, whether it's Palestine, Israel, whether it's Iraq, whether it's the like. I mean, you hear about hundreds dying and you never see these kind of airstrikes. So I think there is a grave hypocrisy.
But Sami, it seems like the US and its allies are damned if they intervene and damned if they don't. They destroyed 3 sites that were used to produce and store chemical weapons, and President Trump said that it was mission accomplished. So weren't the strikes effective?
The reality is that the US, these airstrikes, and the Russian knows it, they're desperate measures. It's the US kind of saying we have no plan, but we need to do something to show that we're still involved in Syria and that we still have a say in it. When the Free Syria Army were marching on Damascus, Russia came in, heavily bombed Syria and sent its troops in order to protect the Syrian regime. Russia will not allow the Assad regime to fall. It's a red line for them and it's a red line for the Iranians. I think even the US does not want an escalation in Syria because it's not ready. It does not have a viable Syria government to prop up after Assad. The US tends to plan these things. In Iraq, when it took down Saddam Hussein, it had personalities ready to take over the government. But if I was to ask anybody today who would take over after Bashar al-Assad, nobody would be able to give a name. And I think that is a stumbling block for the US.
Okay, so I get all of that, Sami. But the idea here is to find a solution. So what can the US and its allies do to realistically change the reality on the ground and to reignite the hope of the Syrian revolution?
The power of negotiation, the negotiating power of these countries is very weak. It is weak because Russia and Iran have ground troops in Syria that can actually mobilize and take advantage of airstrikes. US does not. Turkey does not. And this is the reason why it is very imbalanced. Because let's be honest, Turkey's only real problem with the US at this moment in time is the fact that the US continue to support the YPG. The Turkey is saying we can offer you an alternative, that is the Free Syria Army. The US needs to decide whether it is willing to commit to that suggestion from Turkey.